In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French and conqueror of Europe, marched into Russia with what was then the largest army the world had ever seen. Over 600,000 soldiers, dozens of nations, cannons, cavalry, and engineers. A force so massive it was called the Grand Army. But by the time he stumbled back across the border months later, fewer than 100,000 remained. What happened? You might think it was the Russian winter or the sheer size of the country. And yes, those things played a part. But the real story is far more surprising, more human, and more haunting. Because Napoleon didn't just lose to snow and space. He lost to psychology, sabotage, and a string of miscalculations that even the greatest general in the world couldn't recover from. This isn't just a story of failure. It's a story of how pride can blind, how power can isolate, and how even an emperor can freeze in his tracks. Let's unravel why it all collapsed. Why Napoleon invaded Russia in the first place. To understand why Napoleon invaded Russia, we have to rewind to the height of his power. By 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte had done the impossible. He had taken control of nearly all of continental Europe. Prussia, Austria, Spain, Italy, all were either conquered or allied under French influence. Only two real powers stood outside his grasp: Great Britain and the vast, unpredictable empire of Russia. Britain, protected by its navy, was a constant thorn in Napoleon's side. He couldn't defeat it militarily, so he tried something else: economic strangulation. In 1806, he introduced the Continental System, a massive blockade banning European countries from trading with Britain. The idea was to crush Britain's commerce and force its government to negotiate. But for this to work, every major European power had to comply. And that's where Russia became a problem. Tsar Alexander I had agreed to join the blockade after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, but it didn't last. Russia's economy depended heavily on trade with Britain, particularly in goods like timber, hemp, and grain. By 1810, Alexander had quietly resumed commerce with the British. Napoleon was furious. But it wasn't just about economics. It was about ego. Napoleon believed Alexander had betrayed him, and betrayal to Napoleon was personal. He saw himself as the architect of Europe's destiny. Anyone defying him was standing in the way of history. Then there were the deeper tensions. Napoleon had married Marie-Louise of Austria, cementing an alliance with Austria and snubbing a proposed marriage to one of the Tsar's sisters. That snub, slight as it may seem, added frost to an already chilly relationship. So, in 1812, Napoleon decided to bring Russia back in line, by force. He began planning the invasion in late 1811, and what he planned wasn't a campaign, it was a spectacle. He called upon troops from across the continent: Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Swiss, even some reluctant Spaniards. Over 600,000 men from around 20 nations assembled along the Niemen River. It was the largest army ever seen in European history at the time. Napoleon believed it would be quick. He expected a few key battles, a swift march to Moscow, and a forced Russian surrender. But Russia was not Spain, it was not Austria, and it was definitely not quick. From the start, things began to unravel in ways no one expected. The march that became a maze. On June 24, 1812, Napoleon's Grand Army crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. The air was hot, the soldiers wore wool, spirits were high. But within weeks, cracks appeared. The first problem? Logistics. Napoleon had assumed that the army could live off the land, as they had in past campaigns. But Russia was vast and sparsely populated. Villages were small and far apart. Supplies were scarce. The army brought food, of course, but not enough for months. And the further they advanced, the longer their supply lines became. Then came disease. Dysentery, typhus, and lice spread like wildfire. Some 80,000 men were lost before the first major battle. But the most clever and perhaps most brutal strategy came from the Russians themselves. Rather than stand and fight, they retreated, again and again. The Russian army, led by General Barclay de Tolly and later by Prince Kutuzov, practiced a scorched earth policy. They burned crops, destroyed villages, and poisoned wells. Every step the French army took brought them deeper into hostile terrain with fewer resources. Napoleon had expected a grand showdown. Instead, he was chasing shadows. One battle finally came at Smolensk in August. The French captured the city, but it was in ruins. The Russians had set it on fire before fleeing. Then came Borodino on September 7th. It was the bloodiest single-day battle of the entire campaign. Around 70,000 casualties. Napoleon won the field, but just barely. The Russian army retreated again. No surrender, no peace offering, just ashes and silence. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow on September 14th, his army had been reduced to less than 250,000 men. But Moscow wasn't a prize. It was a trap. The city had been evacuated and set ablaze by Russian partisans. No food, no shelter, and no sign of Tsar Alexander. Napoleon waited. Days turned into weeks. Winter crept in. Still, no peace. And with each passing day, Napoleon's confidence melted like snow on boots. He had reached the heart of Russia, only to find it empty. How Napoleon's miscalculations sealed his fate. Napoleon had always relied on speed, surprise, and precision. But in Russia, every one of those advantages vanished. His first major miscalculation? Geography. Napoleon underestimated just how vast and empty Russia truly was. Maps of the time were inaccurate. Roads that looked passable on paper turned into mud-slick trails or disappeared altogether. His troops spent weeks trudging through forests and swamps with no enemy in sight. Every step forward stretched his supply lines thinner. Communications broke down. Ammunition couldn't reach the front lines fast enough. Horses died by the thousands, so soldiers pulled carts themselves. And then came his second miscalculation: the Russian people. Napoleon believed that once he captured Moscow, the Russians would surrender. That's what happened in Austria, Prussia, and elsewhere. But Russia wasn't like the others. Moscow wasn't even the political capital. St. Petersburg was. And Tsar Alexander I was not going to negotiate. Instead of breaking Russia's will, the burning of Moscow galvanized it. The population united in resistance. Even peasants became partisan fighters, attacking French supply wagons, ambushing isolated units, and disappearing into the forests. Napoleon's third miscalculation was time. He had assumed the campaign would be over in 5 weeks. Instead, he stayed in Moscow for over a month, hoping for negotiations that never came. When he finally decided to retreat in mid-October, it was already too late. The first snow had fallen. And with that snow came another silent killer: cold. Most of Napoleon's soldiers didn't have proper winter clothing. They'd marched into Russia in summer uniforms, thin wool jackets and worn-out boots. Now, temperatures plunged below minus 20 degrees Celsius, minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. Frostbite spread. Fingers turned black. Soldiers froze to death while sleeping. Cannons were abandoned because horses could no longer pull them, and there were no horses left to eat either. The weather wasn't the only enemy. Russian cavalry, led by the relentless General Kutuzov, began harassing the retreating columns, striking from the flanks, burning bridges behind them, and ensuring the French had no safe route home. At the Berezina River in late November, the French attempted a desperate crossing. 2 makeshift bridges collapsed under panicked troops. Thousands drowned or were trampled to death. What remained of the army, barely 40,000 men, was now a ghost of what it had once been. Even Napoleon's personal guard, his elite troops, were reduced to rags and desperation. By the time he crossed back over the Niemen River in December 1812, only about 10,000 soldiers remained combat effective. Over 400,000 had died. Another 100,000 were captured or missing. The rest were dead from starvation, disease, exposure, or exhaustion. But perhaps Napoleon's greatest miscalculation was emotional. He believed that logic would dictate events, that rational leaders like Alexander would eventually see reason. But war, especially in Russia, is never just about logic. It's about land, identity, and survival. Napoleon didn't just fail to conquer Russia, he failed to understand it. The retreat that turned into a nightmare. If the march into Russia was brutal, the retreat was something out of a nightmare. As the remnants of the Grand Army began their long, frozen withdrawal from Moscow, they weren't just low on supplies, they were broken in spirit. Soldiers who had once marched proudly under Napoleon's eagle now limped, starved, and cursed the ground beneath their feet. The roads were filled with corpses of men, horses, and hopes. Desertion skyrocketed. Entire units disappeared into the snow. Some soldiers threw down their weapons and surrendered to Russian peasants, preferring captivity over certain death. Others looted dead comrades just to stay warm. Cannibalism, though rare, was not unheard of. Eyewitness accounts describe starving men boiling leather straps or gnawing on the flesh of frozen corpses. Napoleon tried to maintain control. He rode ahead of the columns, issued commands, gave speeches, but even his presence couldn't reverse the unraveling. One of the most haunting episodes occurred at the village of Krasny in November. The Russian army ambushed the retreating French, cutting them into fragments. Napoleon personally led a counterattack to hold the line. It worked, but only barely. He lost thousands more. Still, there were acts of bravery. At the Berezina River, Marshal Eblé, a French engineer, built 2 bridges under heavy fire in freezing water. He and his men stood waist-deep in icy currents to give the army a path across. Nearly 40,000 men escaped because of them. Eblé died shortly after from illness, but his sacrifice saved what little was left. Then, on December 5th, Napoleon made a stunning decision. He left. With his empire under threat back in Paris and his enemies stirring across Europe, Napoleon slipped away from the retreating army and rode to France in disguise, leaving Marshal Ney in command. Marshal Michel Ney became the symbol of the army's final days. Known as the bravest of the brave, Ney refused to abandon his men. At the rear of the column, he held off Russian attacks day after day, covering the retreat at every turn. With just a few thousand men, he fought rearguard actions that delayed Russian advances and saved thousands. On December 14th, the last French troops stumbled across the Niemen River, back where they had started 6 months earlier. Out of more than 600,000 men who crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 made it out. Most never returned home. The invasion was not just a military failure, it was a human tragedy. It ended Napoleon's aura of invincibility. The myth of his perfection was shattered. And though he would fight again, at Leipzig and later at Waterloo, his fate had been sealed in the snows of Russia. Conclusion. So why did Napoleon's invasion of Russia fail? It wasn't just the cold, or the size of the country, or the brilliance of the Russian generals. It was pride, arrogance, a refusal to adapt. Napoleon believed he could bend Russia to his will, just as he had with so many others. But Russia didn't play by his rules. The scorched earth, endless steppe, the burning of Moscow, the refusal to surrender, and the winter that arrived like a silent army. All of it chipped away at a force that seemed unstoppable, until it wasn't. And in the end, the emperor who had once stood on the shoulders of giants returned home alone in defeat. The invasion of Russia didn't just break Napoleon's army, it broke the man himself. And it taught the world that no power, not even the greatest on earth, is safe from hubris, frostbite, and the fury of a land that refuses to be conquered. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history, impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events? If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about the part Napoleon played after the French Revolution, check out our book, Napoleonic Wars, a captivating guide to the Napoleonic Wars and War of 1812. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you found the video captivating, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.